The sun shone brightly over the Miami port on the morning of June 8, 1985, as passengers waited to board the MS Pacific Sky, a medium-sized cruise ship set for a week-long journey through the Caribbean. Among the many excited travelers were Eleanor and Michael Rowe Newlyweds from Asheville, North Carolina, both aged 28. They had tied the knot just 3 years ago, days before, in a small backyard ceremony, and were full of anticipation. The cruise was a surprise wedding present from Eleanor's parents, an all-inclusive honeymoon, to Nassau, St. Thomas, and the Dominican Republic. Michael, a high school biology teacher, was calm, methodical, and quietly observant. Eleanor, by contrast, was outgoing, artistic, and liked to record every moment with her vintage Minolta camera, which she wore proudly across her chest. The pair had been together since college and were known to be inseparable. They were given cabin 422B on the starboard side of the lower deck, modest yet comfortable. The ship departed at 4:45 p.m. and by nightfall was far off the Florida coast, sailing on calm seas. Over the next 2 days, several passengers remembered seeing the Rows, often laughing at evening shows, dancing on the open deck under string lights, and enjoying cocktails at the Horizon Lounge. Eleanor was especially social, starting conversations and taking candid photos of strangers, promising to send them later. On the third night, June 10th, they were spotted dining alone at the Coral Reef restaurant, dressed up for the formal dinner. This was the last confirmed sighting of them. By the next morning, June 11th, the mood on board had shifted. Steward Carlos Mendez, who cleaned Deck 4 cabins, noticed that 422B had not been entered since the previous night. The bed was untouched, and both suitcases were open and half unpacked. Eleanor's camera was gone. Michael's watch, which he never removed, was left on the nightstand. Initially, the crew thought they had overslept or gone on an early shore trip. But when they failed to check in during the ship's stop at Nassau and their names were missing from excursion logs, suspicion grew. At 6:30 p.m., Captain Raymond Holtz was informed and ordered a complete search of the ship, including public spaces, restricted areas, and the engine room. No sign of Eleanor or Michael appeared. The next day, the ship reached San Juan, Puerto Rico. Local Coast Guard and the U.S. Consulate were notified, and a formal missing persons report was made. The trip was cut short, and the vessel returned to Miami, with investigators already aboard, taking statements from passengers. No one had seen the Rows after June 10th. There were no signs of struggle, no reports of disturbance from nearby cabins, and no activity on their expense accounts. It was as if they had vanished. The FBI began a joint probe with U.S. Maritime authorities, considering foul play, but also an accident, like falling overboard. Lead investigator Special Agent Dana Whitmore, assigned in July 1985, was unconvinced. There had been no bad weather that night, no wind, no storms, and the decks were dry. In a 1997 interview, she said couples do not just disappear mid-cruise without any clue, especially not like the Rows. Relatives and friends were questioned. Eleanor's sister said they were deeply in love with no history of problems. Michael's colleagues called him dependable and steady. There were no signs of financial strain and no large insurance policies. Security logs showed no alarms or odd card activity. The last use of the cabin key was 11:14 p.m. June 10th assumed to be their return from dinner. Some photos developed from a roll. Eleanor dropped off on June 9th, showed happy passengers, a sunset over open water, and one striking image of Michael looking at the horizon. But the last roll inside her missing camera was never found. By early 1986, with no leads or evidence, the case faded from the news and was archived as an unresolved maritime disappearance. Their families tried to keep it alive. Eleanor's mother, Judith Pearson, sent letters to senators, travel agencies, and cruise line executives urging action. Michael's younger brother, Thomas Rowe, traveled to Nassau and Puerto Plata, speaking to fishermen and dock workers. No one had seen them or remembered their names. In 1988, 3 years after they vanished, the cruise company Eastern Caribbean Voyages Ltd. Sold the MS Pacific Sky to another operator, and it was renamed. Cabin 422B was reportedly remodeled and given a new number. By 1990, the Roes were mostly forgotten outside North Carolina, and the case became one of many cruise disappearances that year. There was no fraud, no ransom, no bodies, only silence. Until nearly 12 years later, when something changed. On May 16, 1997, on the southern coast of the Dominican Republic, near the little-known fishing village of Las Roas, a remote cove hit by tides and known only to locals, a fisherman named Luis Enriquez, aged 54, walked along the shore after a night storm. Debris littered the sand branches, seaweed, and plastic, but one object caught his eye, a seaweed-covered duffel bag stuck under volcanic rocks. He pulled it free. The zipper was rusted, yet the bag was intact. Back in the village, he and a neighbor forced it open. Inside were 2 worn U.S. passports, a woman's compact camera, a water-damaged notebook, and soaked personal belongings. There were postcards, a small jewelry box, and bits of fabric. The notebook's pages were blurred and unreadable, but the camera still held a 35mm film roll in its metal case. Luis brought the passports to the police in the nearby town of Verona, where the names were quickly flagged by an international system. Michael Rowe and Eleanor Rowe missing since 1985. News of the find reached the U.S. Embassy in Santo Domingo within 2 days. The belongings were secured and sent to Quantico, Virginia, for testing. The priority was developing the film in Eleanor's long-missing camera. The roll was badly damaged after years of moisture and exposure, but 6 frames were saved. They were grainy, faded, and worn at the edges, but still recognizable. One showed Eleanor smiling next to a lifeboat in a red sundress. Another was a blurry shot of the ocean at night from the deck. One image captured Michael at dinner, raising a glass of wine. Another showed a man in a white uniform, not identified as any crew member, standing beside a storage hatch on the outer deck, his face partly hidden by glare. The last 2 photos were a self-timer of Eleanor and Michael, smiling uneasily, near what looked like a lower utility corridor off-limits to passengers, and the final image showed an open hatch with the sea far below and a bent handrail in the shadows. The FBI reopened the Rowe case in June 1997, almost 12 years after the disappearance, assigning it to Special Agent Lauren Keats, a veteran investigator with expertise in maritime incidents. She received the original case files, the recovered belongings, and the developed photographs. Keats began by reviewing the 1985 passenger manifest. More than 600 passengers and 118 crew had sailed, but only a small number were fully interviewed. The file had about 30 statements, mostly from nearby cabins' dining staff and entertainment workers. With the new photos, especially the one of the man in a white uniform near the restricted hatch, Keats focused her attention. Digital specialists at Quantico cleaned the image enough to reveal some details. The man wore a uniform unlike those in the ship's records and had a visible scar above his left eyebrow. Beside him was part of a cleaning cart, an older style used by maintenance crews. Matching this to 1985 employment records proved difficult. The cruise company merged in 1989, and many documents were missing, but Keats obtained a partial subcontractor list. One name drew her attention: Idard F. Morales. A 34-year-old from Panama had worked as a contracted cleaner for 3 months that summer. He had no U.S. criminal record, but Interpol noted a sealed report tying him to a 1983 ferry incident involving a missing passenger. Morales vanished from all records after 1987. No taxes, no border entries, no renewed work permits. Keats reached out to surviving crew. Many had retired, but some responded. Antonio Tony Dloa, a bartender in 1985, recognized the man instantly. He said they called him El Cencio, a quiet figure, often mopping near restricted decks at night, who made him uneasy. Another former worker, Maria Estrella, a housekeeper on Deck 4, recalled faintly hearing a woman scream on June 10th. When she told security, she was told it was likely a drunk guest and ordered back to work. Neither account had been in the 1985 file. Keats studied the photo of the hatch and bent rail. Using ship blueprints from Maritime archives, she determined it was near the starboard maintenance corridor by the emergency vent. Access a narrow locked area used only by technical crew. This location had no surveillance, but maintenance had override keys. If the Rose went there, willingly or not, they could have been lured, or one may have followed the other. The evidence was enough to form a theory, but the question remained what happened after that photo was taken, and why was Eleanor's bag found so far away 12 years later. To find out, Keats consulted the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and ocean drift expert, Dr. Miguel Anaya. Using historic weather data and satellite images, he modeled likely drift paths in the Caribbean from 1985 to 1997. His findings were persuasive. If the bag entered the water near the eastern Dominican coast, currents could have carried it in a slow clockwise loop within the north equatorial current. Over years, it could pass Puerto Rico, drift east into open waters, then back west toward the southern coast, especially if trapped in seasonal eddies or hurricane-driven flows. The bag could have floated for years before a seasonal storm in 1997 finally pushed it ashore. Dr. Miguel Anaya explained to Keats that what had happened to Eleanor's duffel bag was not as unusual as it sounded. The Caribbean, he said, could keep secrets for years. Objects tossed into the water might vanish into the vast network of currents, only to wash ashore hundreds of miles from where they began. Still, something about this bag stood out. It had survived in remarkably good condition for something supposedly adrift for more than a decade. His theory was that it might have been lodged somewhere, perhaps wedged under a coral outcrop, trapped beneath reef structures, or caught in the framework of a shipwreck, and had only recently been released by a storm or shifting tide. The idea carried a disturbing implication. If the bag had been preserved like that, then other things might have been as well. That could mean parts of the Rose belongings, more evidence, or Even their remains could still be somewhere underwater, hidden away in places that had never been thoroughly searched when they first vanished. Among the water-damaged contents of the bag was something deeply personal, a small notebook that had once been Eleanor's travel journal. The cover was faded and warped, the paper brittle from salt exposure. Most of the pages were smeared into illegibility by seawater. But the FBI's forensic analysts at Quantico used an ink enhancement technique, carefully working under magnification until faint lines emerged. On one page, a fragment of a sentence appeared in shaky blue handwriting. He said we shouldn't be here, not safe. Mike thinks he's lying. The date was missing, and the surrounding context was gone, but the tone was unmistakable. Eleanor had felt they were somewhere they were not meant to be, and Michael suspected deception. To Keats, this was more than a clue. It was a near-direct confirmation that they had been led, willingly or under duress, into a restricted area. The words suggested fear and mistrust, and they supported her growing belief that the couple's disappearance had been deliberate, not an accident of drunken misadventure or a simple case of falling overboard. In late August of 1997, months into the reopened investigation, Keats received a call routed through the FBI's Panama City office. The man on the line refused at first to give his full name. He claimed he had served on a Caribbean cruise ship in the mid-1880s and recognized the photo of the uniformed man with a scar over his eyebrow, the one circulated in newspapers after being recovered from Eleanor's camera. "That's Morales," the man said flatly. "We all knew he was trouble." He eventually identified himself only as Raul and agreed to meet with FBI agents in San Jose, Costa Rica, where he had been living under another name. Raul's account added new weight to Keats's suspicions. He said that in 1984, Morales had been caught breaking into a female passenger's cabin at night. Instead of involving police, the cruise company quietly dismissed him to avoid public scandal. His official record was altered. His name was removed from permanent crew logs. Yet somehow, by 1985, he was back aboard another cruise, the very voyage where the Rose vanished. Raul also revealed something else. Morales was rumored to possess a private key ring granting access to secured hatches and maintenance corridors that were supposed to be off-limits to anyone except senior engineers. No one knew how he had obtained them. Some whispered he was blackmailing someone in management. Others thought he had simply stolen them during one of his short contracts. But the fact remained. He could go anywhere on the ship without being questioned. With that information, Keats submitted a formal request to the U.S. Maritime Recovery Commission for a focused underwater investigation of the MS Pacific Sky. The ship had been sold, renamed, and heavily modified in the 1990s, but Lloyd's Register of Shipping in London still maintained the original blueprints from 1985. Among the detailed maps of its corridors and auxiliary spaces, one feature caught Keats's eye. A sealed utility shaft beneath the starboard deck, right beside the corridor seen in Eleanor's final photo. The shaft ended in a discharge port used for releasing treated gray water into the sea. If tampered with, it could have been used to force objects, or people, into the ocean without drawing attention. Keats partnered with a salvage company operating out of Grand Turk. Using archived navigational logs, they pinpointed areas where the ship had slowed unexpectedly during its 1985 voyage. Over 3 weeks, side-scan sonar and submersible drones combed the seabed. On September 14, 1997, they found something startling: the rusted metal frame of a cruise line utility locker lying 213 feet below the surface. Its door was missing, hinges corroded, and the faded paint still carried the words "Property of Eastern Caribbean Voyages, Tahit." Inside were tangled coils of cable, rusted tools, and one strange item: a plastic vacuum pouch, still sealed. When opened, it revealed a crew access card bearing the name E.F. Morales. This was the first hard physical evidence tying Morales to the time and place of the Rose disappearance. The card's presence at that depth in the very waters the Pacific Sky had passed strongly suggested an attempt to destroy or hide the link. Keats pushed forward. If the couple had indeed been forced through the utility shaft, their remains might still lie in underwater trenches nearby. The U.S. Navy's Underwater Forensics Division joined the effort, expanding the search radius based on tidal drift patterns. The terrain below was difficult: jagged coral shelves, deep crevices, scattered wreck debris. But on October 9, 1997, an ROV camera caught something small but unmistakable: a pair of white sneakers, partially buried in silt beside a rock ledge. Just inches away lay the corroded frame of a camera lens, matching the model Eleanor had been seen holding in one of the recovered photographs. Lab analysis confirmed the shoelaces were consistent with those Eleanor had worn in that same photo. No human remains were found nearby. The ocean had likely claimed the bodies long ago, dispersing or burying them beyond recovery. Still, this was the closest the families had come to closure in 12 years. Interpol issued a red notice for Morales, but no trace of him surfaced: no passport renewals, no bank activity, no sightings. Theories ranged from suicide to fleeing under an assumed identity, to being silenced by someone else who feared exposure. By 1999, the Maritime Commission officially classified the Rose case as presumed homicide by unknown individuals. The cruise line, under quiet legal pressure, reached a confidential financial settlement with both families without admitting fault. The photographs from Eleanor's bag remain sealed in FBI archives, except for one. It shows Eleanor and Michael in that narrow corridor, smiling, but with a visible tension in their eyes. They cling to each other in a way that suggests they already knew something was wrong. That image now rests in a simple frame on Eleanor's mother's mantelpiece. 2 candles burn beside it every June 10th, the day they disappeared. They never got their honeymoon, her mother once told a reporter, but at least after all this time they didn't just vanish without a trace.